Okay, good morning, everyone. Can we have your attention? Ladies and gentlemen, can we have your attention? Thank you for being here on time. Let's make sure we all have a seat. And out of respect for our speaker, any speaker, all of our hoods should be down, caps off, phones silenced. We have a very special guest speaker today. There's going to be a very brief 10 or 11 minute video introduction to the topic of the Holocaust. But our speaker today is a gentleman by the name of Mr. Paul Galan, who's been at Northern Valley many times before. Mr. Galan's a native of the former Czechoslovakia, and he and his family were fortunate to survive the Holocaust through a series of unusual circumstances and a great deal of luck. Mr. Galan immigrated to the United States as a teenager in 1951, and after completing his education in high school and college here in the New York area, he began working as a director of documentary television programs for ABC News and other broadcast groups such as Westinghouse and Capital Cities. He's filmed and interviewed some very famous people as well as others. But more importantly, the reason we're all here today is that on his retirement in 2006, he decided to put his skills as a communicator towards disseminating information about the horrors and tragedy of the Holocaust. And to share his own story and some memories of others during that dark period in history. And Mr. Galan is a member of the Board of Trustees of the Holocaust Museum and Center for Tolerance and Education in Suffern, New York. And Mr. Galan has a very important first-person account to tell about the Holocaust. So we expect direct attention. And before Mr. Galan begins, this is a brief 12-minute lead-in of what was termed the Auschwitz death camp. It's about 11 minutes.
Hi guys, in this vlog we met up with our friend EJ to visit Auschwitz. Now there's no way to really ease into this vlog, it's a brutal place. It's not fun to visit, but it's important too. If you're planning to visit here, you can pay for a guided tour, most of which include return transport to and from Krakow. It takes about an hour and a half to get there, and some of the buses play important documentaries about the Holocaust on your journey. You don't have to get a guided tour, however, you can explore the place by yourself, but since we didn't have much time, I wanted to get a guide to get as much information as possible. You do need your ID to visit, so please remember to bring your license or passport to enter. And then you'll receive a headset from your tour guide where they will speak into a mic and you'll be able to hear it on the headset. Now, I'm sure you're all very well aware of what Auschwitz is and what took place there, but to give you a brief overview, Auschwitz is a concentration camp located in southern Poland. It is broken up into 3 camps: Auschwitz I, Auschwitz II, known as Birkenau, and Auschwitz III, known as Monowitz. The tour starts in Auschwitz I.
So, first of all, convenient location, and what's more, before the war, Poland was home for 3 million Jews. There were 3 million Jews on this spot. There was no need to bring them here. There were so many of them. So convenient location, the largest Jewish community in those days, and far away in the east. Very easy to keep everything secret. That's why Nazis select the culture of kinship and they call it Auschwitz.
This photo broke me. It's taken right after selection, and you can see a woman holding her baby and 3 little boys up front. There's no crying, screaming, or even panic on their faces. This is because they had no idea what was about to happen to them. Nazis had told them to put their suitcases in a room and to remember exactly where they left it, as they would be coming back for it. But they were all killed in a gas chamber minutes after this photo was taken. Three kilometres down the road is where you'll find Auschwitz II, known as Birkenau. Birkenau is the largest death camp in Europe. Auschwitz II was above all a centre for the extermination of Jews. Over 1.5 million people were murdered here. And if you think about it, it's the largest cemetery ever recorded in history. One of the most important places here is the selection site. Here is where families were herded out of cattle cars and stripped of their belongings. Families were physically pulled apart, and the majority of them would never lay eyes on each other again. It's where Nazis decided whether people were going to work at the camp or be sent to the gas chambers immediately. In Birkenau, there are no exhibits. It's not a museum. The only thing built in memory of the victims is a monument which stands next to the site of what was once a gas chamber. During the peak of extermination, 4 brave Jewish women attempted an uprising against the Nazis. These women, who worked in the factories, smuggled small amounts of gunpowder wrapped in paper to the Jewish workers in the crematorium. Over several months, they had gathered enough gunpowder to try and destroy the gas chamber. The Germans crushed the revolt, killing 250 prisoners during the fight, and guards shot another 200 after the mutiny was suppressed. Several days later, the SS identified 4 Jewish female prisoners who had been involved in supplying explosives, and all 4 women were executed. The last place we were shown was the children's barracks. This was for women and non-Jewish children who were to work up to life. The living conditions are beyond our comprehension. They had no running water, and it's not like they just didn't wash for a day or 2 or even a week. It was months without a wash. So the smell was horrendous. SS guards gave orders in German, but the people who were forced to live here were brought from all over Europe, so not everybody spoke German. In turn, there was a lot of shouting, crying, screaming, and confusion. Lastly, hunger. Prisoners were forced to work 12-hour days and were fed 1,100 calories a day, officially. They were given coffee or herbs and water for breakfast, vegetable soup for lunch, and a piece of bread for dinner. They were walking skeletons.
Polish children were housed in this building. Many of them were alone here. No mother, no father, nobody to take care of them. Children were crying, were deeply depressed. So prisoners, adults, they wanted to boost the spirit, and they decorated walls in this building. So you can see original decorations.
If we could give a Northern Valley Demarest welcome to Mr. Galan.
Good morning, everyone. Can you all hear me all right? Yes. Wonderful. Good. This camp that you just saw the movie about is probably the most hated, the most terrible place that has ever been built by human beings in order to murder other human beings. It looks like a beautiful place in those film shots right now, because it's been cleaned up, it's been made look good, but it's not really giving you a sense of what it was all about. Now, I was one of the very lucky people who was never in this camp. I lived in another country called formerly Czechoslovakia, but the Nazis have penetrated most of the European countries and have controlled and taken away and murdered and did all sorts of horrible things to 6 million, mostly Jewish people. 6 million, can you imagine that? It's you know, the idea of 6 million people being murdered for no reason other than the fact that they were of a different faith, of a different religion, of different backgrounds. It didn't matter. They were all human beings. And they were taken away from their homes, from places where they have been raised and lived for many years, where they have been raised, where they had their schools, where they had their synagogues, where they had houses of learning. All that was destroyed for one reason: to murder. Just to murder innocent people. I came from a family of, there were 5 of us. I had twin sisters, my parents and I. We lived in a country called Czechoslovakia at one time. Czechoslovakia was one of the most civilized Eastern European countries with a rich history, with high levels of education, with learning, with being productive. And all of a sudden, this nation of German Nazis who have decided that they are going to murder all the Jews they can because they are what they call Untermenschen, which means under human beings, because they belonged, they were raised in a faith that was a terrible nation to be, to teach, to learn. They were just looking to murder every Jewish human being, and other people too, by the way, that they could get their hands on. And this was all part of a war that was really looking to create destruction more than anything else. I was a little kid when it all started. I lived in a smaller town with my parents. My father was a grain merchant, We lived in an area that was an agricultural area, and my father and his father learned about the raising of grain, all kinds of grain, and to be turned into food for human consumption. However, being that my father was Jewish, and being that the town we lived in had a sizable Jewish population, it was picked as a town that was perfectly suitable for taking people away from their homes, being sent off to other countries such as Poland or Germany, where there were already places of death that had been prepared, and to annihilate as many people of the Jewish faith as could possibly be murdered. So my family, we tried to find ways of saving our lives. My two older sisters, my parents, I also had grandparents, aunts, uncles, living in a town with a sizable Jewish population. And these people were suddenly determined to be subhuman people. Because they were considered bad people who were out to murder, to kill the God of Christianity, and they had to be wiped out, they had to be punished, and made disappear from the face of the earth. There were 6 million Jewish people murdered between 1939 and 1944. There was a war all throughout Europe and much of the world. And it was everything was being blamed on the Jews. And it was a good reason to kill them. Well, regardless of whether their educational background was outstanding, regardless of whether people had the ability to help civilized lives. No, none of that was important. The only thing that seemed to have mattered to the Nazis who determined that the Jews had to be totally, completely wiped off the face of the earth. And they would every possible device, every possible movement to murder. Whether it was in camps such as Auschwitz, where there were 3 or 4 gas chambers and crematoria, and people were taken off trains that brought them from their home states. They were taken off the trains, and those who seemed to be worth of performing hard labor were marked for continuing to live, while other people who were not labor capable, they were just sent to crematorias, to gas chambers, where they were murdered, their ashes, their bodies put into crematoria where they were burnt to ashes. And more people were being put into these places of horror, just to annihilate them. So my family and I, as I said, we lived in this small town, but we were being taken away from our home. We were being taken away to a labor camp where we were supposed to, we didn't know what was to be done with us. All we knew was that our lives were restricted, our education was interrupted, people who were capable of hard labor or otherwise were put to labor and then gradually shipped out of the countries of their origin to places of death. But before they were dead, they were put to work, being starved, being punished, being humiliated in every possible way. Now, I was a kid. My sisters were a little older than I. But each one of us had a place where we were being placed. Whether it was being put in a factory, whether it was being put into a sewing shop, clothing manufacturer. Labor had to be done fast so that it could be sold off or shipped out to other parts of Europe. And then as much and the people to be starved as much as possible, denied food, denied decent living, denied decent sanitation. The living conditions were horrible. And the whole idea was to deprave the Jewish people and gradually annihilate them. So I was a kid. I went to a school which was not much of a school. My parents were put to labor within these camps that we were sent to. Eventually, my two sisters were separated from us and shipped out to places unknown. My parents managed to survive. I managed to survive, but all under guard, all under punishment, all under threats of punishment. It was really a horrible way of life. Not knowing how our lives were going to end up. We did not know about a place like Auschwitz because it was a secret. It was not known that Auschwitz was a death camp where people were put to work, to forced labor, to famine, to starved, to live in inhuman conditions in barracks. to be exposed to cold weather, hot weather, you name it. It didn't matter. You had to work, you had to be a slave laborer. And that was the only thing that you were allowed to know. Until people just collapsed, passed away, and were eventually burned to ashes and buried in the ground, buried in different places, buried in huge graves, covered up so that no one would know what transpired there. Well, my family, we were fortunate. Both my sisters ended up in different places. We did not know where they were going or where they were being taken or what's being done with them. My parents and I managed to escape at one point into the mountains of the country, which was our homeland originally, called Slovakia. And the only way we could try and survive was by changing our identity, by practicing a different religion so that we would not be recognized as Jews, by finding shelter in farmhouses with some friendly farmers who did not realize that we were of the Jewish faith, but we were still working with them and for them. And the most frightening part of the whole thing was that the German troops would come into these villages where we were hiding, and they would be looking for people who were either resistance fighters or Jewish people or any kind of resistance, providing any kind of resistance against the Nazis. Hiding, denying our background was part of the skill that we had to develop in order to survive. Playing with other kids in some of the farmhouses was very nice, but pretending that we were something different from what they were, that we were Christians and that we had to learn very quickly some of the practices of Christianity. It was all part of a horrible, I won't call it a game, because it would have been too much fun if it were a game. But hiding who you are was a game that was very difficult to maintain. Denying who you were, denying the fact that you had an education, but pretended that you were ignorant. All these things were horrible ways of having to live and hiding who you are and being denied decent food and doing all kinds of labor just for the sake of getting some nominal amounts of food. This is what life was like. And winters in the parts of the world that we were living in, the winters were tough. They were difficult. There was very little food available to us, even though there was little food available to some of the farmers and the peasant population. But we had to try and steal or hide whatever foods we were able to secure. It was a very, very difficult life, and constantly denying who you are, and hiding when the German troops came into the villages, hiding in different places, in barns, or some people were decent and they helped you change your identity, while others were looking to betray you to the Nazis, to the Germans. They would go and tell them, there are some Jews living in such and such house. Go get them. I never did any harm to anyone. I never did anything terrible to anyone, nor did my parents. I had no idea where my sisters were. They had disappeared. So it was a constant game of subterfuge. It was frightening. You were hungry. You were scared. You had to lie all the time, pretend something that you are not. And meanwhile, you would notice people who were captured by the Nazis. The Nazis were the German army, basically. They would be captured by them and marched or loaded into trucks or loaded into other kind of vehicles and shipped out from the villages, shipped out to the train stations, and the train stations would take people to places like Auschwitz. And there were many other places like Auschwitz. There were concentration camps. There were death camps. It was a horrible, frightening way to grow up. It was a horrible, frightening way to try and find food, to eat, to scrape together whatever you could from what left over in the farms. And always having to hide if the Germans would show up. Having to hide from being noticed, from being recognized. And this took years. It started in 1939, and it did not end until 1945. You lose sense of yourself. You lose a sense of humanity. You don't know who you can trust and who you cannot trust. It's unbelievable what it's like. And we suffered and we tried to survive for 5 years. And some of us succeeded, some of us did not. Many members of my greater family did not succeed. They were captured, they were shipped out to camps in Poland and other places. I had a grandfather who was 86 years old, and legend had it that he was taken to a camp, and the first day there, he was bludgeoned to death by the guards. He was a nice, sweet, 86-year-old man who knew nothing about evil, who knew nothing about doing evil. The only thing we knew is that we were guilty of having been born as Jews. Never harmed anybody. never harmed any of the other school kids. We tried to be friends. All we wanted was food. All we wanted was a decent place to sleep. And we were being chased from one village to another village to another village. And hiding from the Nazis, from the Germans, as they would come into various villages and go into homes searching for Jews or searching for resistance fighters who did not have to be Jewish, but they were resisting the Nazis. And this took years. And I didn't know where my sisters were. And my father was captured one day by the Nazis and taken away. Taken away by the Nazis. We had no idea where to. We didn't know whether he was alive or dead. So it was just my mother and I. I mean, I was a little kid. And my mother and I had to try and find ways of surviving and lying to people. I wasn't taught to lie. I was always taught to be truthful. But if I didn't lie, I was sure to be captured. So this was people. My sister Susan, I had two sisters. My sister Susan was captured by the Nazis and taken to 3 different camps. The first one was Auschwitz, the one you saw pictures of. She was there for over 6 months, performing hard labor. When winter came, they had no winter clothes. They had no warm clothes. They had wooden shoes. That's what they were given to wear. And every morning they were marched out of the camp to some mine or factory where they had to work hard all day long. They were fed once a day. Once a day. Some kind of soup and a piece of dry bread. And that was their only sustenance. And then at the end of the day, they were marched under guard and surrounded by vicious dogs, by the way, back to their camps, back to the barracks, back to wooden bunks where they were piled 5 people, 6 people on top one another. And Susan was in that camp for months, every day being shipped out for some kind of other form of labor. My sister Ava, she managed to escape into a village, and we lost track of her. My father was taken away by the Nazis because they suspected him of being a Jew, and we didn't know what happened to my father. So the only 2 people who were left together were my mother and I. I was in my 8, 9 years old, 10 years old. My mother would repair clothes for the villagers in return for food. We found a place where we could hide at night and sleep at night, and then go to another village because somebody would betray us. And there were millions of other people who were treated the same way except they were being murdered, they were being killed, they were being starved. Starved. I played with local kids in the villages, lying to them about who I am or what I am, and begging them for a piece of bread. This is what life was like. And we did not know what life was like in the camps and what life was like in the forced labor factories or in the fields where all kinds of hard labor was being performed, digging, breaking up rocks, etc., etc., etc. And every once in a while we would see airplanes up in the sky, hoping that these airplanes would come down and bomb the places where we were. But of course they didn't. We were hoping that they would drop food. But they didn't, because they were flying on to other places to help fighting the war. And all you could do was pray and hope that when you wake up the next morning, something good might happen, or you may find a piece of food, or some decent human beings would come along and give you something to eat. You did not feel like human beings. All you had to do was hide, if you could. And time went on, and the war continued, and luckily, the Allies, which were the Americans and the British and the French and the Russians, were beating the Germans. And gradually, over the period of years, Germany was starting to lose the war. And many of the camps were discovered as the liberators came through, and they would come into the camps and find people there absolutely dehumanized in every possible way. Dehumanized in terms of their being, in terms of food, in terms of the labor they had to perform, in terms of the latrines that they were forced to use. It was unbelievable. Unbelievable. But then we started to hear the sounds of bombing, the sounds of artillery in the distance, which gave us hope. Hope that the war might end soon. And in some cases, it was ending. At one point, my mother and I decided that we were going to try and escape from one area where the Germans were still in charge into another area over the mountains where supposedly the country was already liberated by the Russian army, in this case. So we started out for this huge mountain, trying to get across to the so-called liberated area with several other people who gathered up together, and we were all told that if you cross over the mountains, the Russian army is already there and you can be freed. So we tried that. And we started climbing these huge mountains in the winter and got caught in a terrible blizzard, a terrible storm. The snow was blowing. We were exposed to the weather. We were exposed to the wind. A blizzard faced us from all directions. We almost froze to death. Some people did, who didn't have the stamina, and they froze to death. Luckily, my mother and I supported each other, and she was feeding me food that she brought along with us, food that would give you some energy. And we were actually practically frozen to death. I was a kid. I was 9 years old. I was 9 years old. I was starving. I had nothing to eat. I would eat the snow. My mother tried keeping me warm and active if I could, so that I shouldn't freeze to death. And after one horrific night of blizzards, we actually managed to survive that night, the two of us, lost in the mountains. And the following morning, the sun came out, and we were noticed by a group of Russian soldiers, resistance fighters, who gave us some food because we were absolutely on the verge of dying of starvation. And they provided us with a shelter where there was warmth and food. And Mother and I were able to survive. But meanwhile, the Russian soldiers also decided to take my mother aside and rape her. And the Russian soldiers were supposed to be our friends. But they didn't care who the women were. They had their way with them. However, finally, the Russian army, in this case, the Russian army, started really defeating the Germans in this particular area. And we were able to hide for a few days until the Russians liberated the area and the Germans were captured, and we survived and tried to find our way back towards the town that we came from, because there were rumors all over that we are being liberated and that the Germans are being defeated. And they were. And we actually saw them being marched, surrounded by, in this case, Russian soldiers with their guns pointing at them, and they were leading them away. And we finally found areas that were freed, that were liberated, they were free, that we were able to find shelter in some barns. And gradually we worked our way all the way back to the other part of the country where our town was. And we found our way to our hometown. This was already 1945. And we were being so grateful for finding freedom, but we also had to protect ourselves because there were a lot of bad people around. But we finally actually found our way back to my hometown, which was at the easternmost part of the country. We traveled on freight trains from one train to another, and we finally found our way back to my hometown, where we knew no one, but came across one man who used to work for my father, who was a really decent, poor man. When he saw us, he recognized my mother and me and brought us to his home and fed us as best he could. They were poor people too. And we stayed with them. And finally, in the spring of 1945, the war ended. The war ended. There were big celebrations. And we felt free. And eventually, and this was the miraculous part of the whole story, members of my family, meaning my sisters, one at a time, my father, one of my aunts, gradually each one of them came back. My father was released from a concentration camp. And they came back to our hometown, and my family was reunited. Those of us who survived. We also lost a lot of family members. They just disappeared. My sister Susan was very, very ill with typhus, which was a horrible disease. But she managed to hide in a hospital. And she survived. My other sister found her way back home. And months later, people began returning from the concentration camps, from the death camps, those who survived. And guess what? One day, in the middle of one night, my father reappeared. He escaped from a camp and found his way back to our hometown and found us. So gradually, my immediate family, we all reunited. And the war was coming to an end. And we were discovering so many people gone, missing, disappearing from the world. Relatives, cousins, aunts, uncles. But it was time to start renewing our lives, to become productive, to find ways of working and rebuilding our lives, which we managed to accomplish. And by 1946, my sisters were able to get back to school. I went back to school. My father was able to reestablish some parts of his business, the grain business that he was in. And we were hoping to rebuild our lives. However, it wasn't to be that way, because the Russians, who dominated that part of the world and who were the ones who fought the Germans in that part of the world, they decided that they want that country to be part of theirs too. And eventually, the Russian communists took over the region of Czechoslovakia that we lived in, and changed our whole way of life. So instead of becoming a democracy again, which we did for a short period of time, instead we had to become communists. We had to follow the rules established by the Russians. And those rules were not very friendly rules. They took away whatever you owned, whatever you may have discovered after the war. They took things away from you. They took homes away from people. And we decided there's only one way to try and rebuild our lives, and that was to escape from that pro-communist country and find our way to America. And after many months and years of going to different countries where we lived as refugees, we were able to rebuild our lives and eventually get permission to go to America. And that's where we really rebuilt our lives. I went to school. I studied. One of my sisters returned to school and became a pharmacist. My other sister found work. My father could no longer rebuild his business. It was too late. He was getting too old. But he still managed. He still managed to create a life for himself and my mother. So eventually, we found our way to America. And we built new lives here. We built new lives in America. We became so different from the way we used to be under communism and before then under Nazism. America was a whole new world. America was the place where you could start your life all over again. And that's exactly what we did. Those of us who could, or were young enough, or find ways of sustaining lives. We did stay as a family, even though my parents were getting older. My sisters were older than I. I started going to school in America. I met a very pretty girl in school, and we went to school together for quite a while, and eventually we got married, and we built new lives. And we took care of our parents who were getting older. We were not wealthy, but we managed to live decent lives. I worked. I became a filmmaker, and I was making documentary films. One of my sisters became a pharmacist. So everybody found a niche of some kind. I got an education. Eventually, my girlfriend and I got married, and we're still married to this very day. We have wonderful lives together. And I decided that I'm going to not only continue my work as a filmmaker, but also to start teaching what life was like under a dictatorship or under some other group that was trying to dominate your life. And America enabled us to do it. And I have no regrets. I built a family. My parents were getting older and older, but living in peace. My sisters were married, they had children. We rebuilt the family, so to speak, even though there were so many members missing from the family. They were annihilated. So many members of my family did not survive. But we made up for it. And eventually, as I got older and I was successful, I was able to, I started to learn that I have a responsibility. And the responsibility was to teach young people what it was like to live under dictatorships, to live under the Nazis, to live under the Russians. And I devote myself today to teaching about what life was like. And to carry on and to convey to you all, young people, how important it is. How important it is to build and maintain good, productive lives. To learn how to be kind to one another. To learn what horrors can teach young people and older people, and how hatred can spread to other people. And that's why I'm here telling you these stories, because I'm hoping that you are smart enough, intelligent enough to learn and to accept tolerance, to accept the ability to learn about your friends, your neighbors, to learn about how important it is that we be kind and accepting of each other. Because if we don't learn to do that, things can turn bad again. Things can turn bad again. And we can lose our freedom. And we can lose our ability to be accepting of one another. And that's what I'm going to appeal to each and every one of you. To accept, and accept. And learn. Because that's the only way we can make it a better world. And I thank you all very much for your attention. I'll be more than happy to answer questions. Any questions you may have. And
I'll ask them too if they want to have questions. I want to mention that tolerance is a terrible word. Acceptance is. Thank you. Stay right here. Everyone's attention, please. Every marking period we've talked about, whether it was in here or in the South Gym at the beginning of a marking period, and rather than do that at the beginning of the fourth, which just started the other day, we're doing it here today about the power of our language. Tolerance is a horrible word. As you heard Mr. Galan say, acceptance is the word. We talk about, Mr. Galan just talked about compassion, resilience, and most importantly, hope. There is no reason for any of us to have to listen to, read, or hear about anyone saying negative or derogatory things about someone's religion, ethnicity, sexual orientation, or gender. I think in our social studies classes, if you haven't already, you've probably heard of the quote from George Santayana, "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it." This genocide obviously should never be repeated, but analogize it to what we deal with today in our own communities, in our own school, anywhere, about meeting people and accepting every person for who and what they are, regardless of religion, color, ethnicity, gender, or sexual orientation. This message today, this firsthand account of the power of resilience, compassion, and hope is truly one of the more amazing firsthand accounts I think any of us may ever hear in our lives. And what we are asking all of our students today is to carry that compassion, hope, and resilience forward and keep in our minds, in our consciousness, when we meet people, when we interact with people, that we are mindful of our language, how to speak appropriate to everyone. And I apologize for keep repeating this, but again, regardless of color, religion, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, it's acceptance. We are allowed to be who we are in our community, in our school, and most importantly, as our students move forward in life. So there are a few minutes. Does anyone have any questions for Mr. Galan? We can entertain some questions. Yes.
excuse me, hold on a moment so we can hear you. All right? I'm sorry? Oh, sure.
I think you're a really strong person, and I wanted to ask you, how did you manage to deal with the pain during and after the war?
Wow. Good question. Very good question. My family had a lot to do with it because they were strong people, although they suffered a great deal. But we taught one another. We taught one another. And as a child, I know I was always told to be kind, to be considerate. And I continued doing that. And I also got some help. I really got some help, some psychological help, if you will. from which I learned acceptance, which I mentioned before. Acceptance was such an important thing. I went to a school in the Southeast Bronx that was not an upscale school, but there were kids there from all over. There were kids there who from Puerto Rico, from black neighborhoods, you name it. But we learned to understand each other in school. We actually learned to like each other in school. And you made friends. Made friends. And I had two black friends, for example. One became a general in the United States Army, and eventually he became a very well-known foreign minister. We got to know each other. And even though we came from different neighborhoods, but we found commonalities. This was a very famous person. His name was Colin Powell, General Colin Powell. Just a remarkable man, human being. He used to work in a furniture store while I was working in a nearby store doing other work in the Bronx. I don't know if you know what the Bronx is. It's, okay, you do, all right. And my God, we got to know each other. And he became a very famous general and finally became foreign minister of the United States, Secretary of State. And we came in from the same neighborhood in the Bronx, a poor neighborhood. Just, you know, it's amazing what the world can do if you open your eyes and ears and your heart. You know, I became a filmmaker. I made films, documentary films all over the world. And the films that I made all had to have a purpose. It was not to entertain, but it was to educate. And so forth and so on. Number of other people. There was another guy who became a very well-known film producer in Hollywood. You know, so we managed. We knew each other. We became friends. We taught. We were teaching each other. You know, we came from impoverished neighborhoods. But life was good. So that's all I can say is put your heart into it, put your mind into it. Open up gates, open up doors, and try it. See what it's like behind this door or that door. My pleasure. Any other questions?
Mr. Galan, there's another question? Go ahead, sir.
Would you mind standing up and just speaking out loud? Thank you. When what?
When you saw German soldiers being marched off to camps, just as you were by the Russians, how did you feel about that? About their treatment after the war?
I'm sorry, I don't understand the question. Would you
The soldiers, say that again?
When you saw the soldiers who had marched you to camps being marched off to their own camps by the Russians, how did you feel about that?
The German soldiers, how they were treated after the war.
Well, let me put it to you this way. It wasn't easy. I had an experience, which I'm going to share with you. I was in Africa making a documentary film on famine. And one night, it so happens that we ended up having a dinner table together with a group of people. And one of them, everybody had a story to tell. And this one gentleman, he was from Switzerland. And, fine, wonderful. Switzerland, in Switzerland they also speak German and other languages. And we started chatting, and finally I said, "Your accent, where is it from? Is it Swiss Deutsch or Swiss German, or is it German?" He says, "Well, actually, I'm German." I said, "Oh, that's interesting. I thought you were Swiss." He says, "Well, no, I really am not. But I spent some time in the United States after the war as a prisoner of war in a camp. And there I learned better English." I said, "Oh, that's very interesting." So in other words, you were in the German army. He says, "Yes, I was." I said, "Oh, that's interesting. And how did you fare in that camp?" He says, "Well, it was pretty tough. It was difficult for us to be in a labor camp or a concentration camp or whatever it was called." I said, What do you mean?" He says, "Well, we were prisoners of war, and we were not being treated very nicely. We were not being treated very well. We had a tough time." I said, "That's very sad, but, let me ask you a question. What about the hundreds of thousands of people who were captured by the German army and taken to concentration camps, and the way they had to suffer in the concentration camps?" And he said, "Well, that was what the war was all about. And they were not being treated the way we were." It's okay. We were not being treated as prisoners of war as well as people were being treated in your camps. No, it was my saying it to him. A lot of my countrymen, my co-religionists, were in your camps, and many of them didn't live to complain about it. They were murdered. He says, so I said, "Well, how did you feel about being in an American camp and being treated very well, very nicely?" He says, "Well, you Jews," that's the term he used, "you Jews don't know how to behave." And he proceeded to give me a whole story about why the German soldiers were better behaved in the camps than the Jews in the camps. So I said, stop, please stop. What I'm hearing you say to me is that you were a Nazi and you were treated pretty well in an American camp. And the Jews did not necessarily get the same treatment. I said, that's exactly right. They didn't. More of them were killed than treated well. He says, you know, sir, what I'm hearing from you is that you really were looking to be treated the same way as we were. And that is not what the war was all about. That was not what this war was all about. Because all people should have been treated decently. And just because you were from the great German army, you felt privileged. While you Jews did not have that privilege. I said, you know what, sir? I really don't want to continue this conversation. All I want to say to you is, you are truly nothing but a Nazi and you deserved everything you got. I hated to do that. But he opened himself up, even though he pretended he was Swiss. How would you have felt? I'm sorry? Speak up so I can hear you.
I don't know how I would have felt because I didn't go through the way you went.
He said he wouldn't know because he didn't go through it the way you did personally.
Oh, okay. Well, it's true. But this is where we have to look at each other, look upon each other, and as human beings. And if you went through a tough time, and if next to you in the next camp there was a Jewish person who starved and so forth and so on, and you felt that he didn't deserve the same treatment that you did, now where does that put you?
If any student would like to speak to a counselor to process or discuss today's topic or moving forward with hope, resilience, and compassion, as you heard this message relevantly from Mr. Galan today, our SAC, our wellness team, guidance administrators will be available for anyone. Can we give another round of applause to Mr. Galan? I'm going to dismiss them once.